We now begin our third panel.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Jayeeta Sharma. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Toronto. I'm a member of the graduate Department of History, but also of the Culinaria Research Center. And in fact, it's my interest in food studies that drew me to this very interesting conference. And I'm delighted to introduce the featured speaker first, Dr. Janam Mukherjee of Ryerson University, who's an assistant professor of history, and unlike many historians, actually has a very, very interesting past and present. What is relevant for our panel, of course, is that his first book, Hungry Bengal, War, Famine, and the End of Empire, published by Oxford University Press in 2015, is a socioeconomic analysis of mid-20th century Bengal, which looks at the Second World War, the Bengal Famine of 1943, and the Calcutta riots of 1946. And other than his academic work, he, I've just learned, is extremely busy as a creative writer, as well as an activist in many fields, including anti-war movements and also education. So welcome, Dr. Mukherjee. And it also gives me great pleasure to introduce a very distinguished senior scholar from Italy, Professor Andrea Graziosi, who is not only a professor of history at the University of Naples, but is also the president of Italy's National Authority for the Evaluation of Universities and Research. He's a fellow at various distinguished institutions, including Harvard University, Princeton, and at Paris. And he is, of course, extremely well known for his studies on the Soviet famines, and is co-chair of a distinguished series of books and sits on various editorial boards. And of course, amongst the participants, I know you've all had a chance to know each other, and there are at least two people, Joanna and Sri Manjari, who work specifically on South Asian famines and hunger issues. And so I'm sure we'll have a lively discussion, most of which will have to be done tomorrow in the closed session, but I'm hoping we'll have a little bit of time today as well. Thank you very much.
And thanks to the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium for inviting me to give this paper on the Bengal famine, and specifically on the question of colonialism and famine, as well as the question of the causality of colonialism and famine. For many decades now, the question of causality has been central to famine studies, but that has not always been the case. In earlier times, famine was most commonly understood to be the result of environmental catastrophe, agricultural failure, droughts, floods, and the like. If famine received mention in history books, it would be almost incidentally, as an aside to the main action. All that began to change, however, with the publication in 1980 of Amartya Sen's highly acclaimed study, Poverty and Famines, an essay on entitlements and deprivation. In this work, Sen revolutionized famine studies by introducing both chronic poverty and, perhaps more importantly, the concept of entitlements into scholarship about famine. Famine, Sen famously wrote, in quotes, is the characteristic of some people not having enough to eat. It is not necessarily a question of there not being enough to eat. From this rather simple premise, Sen built his theory of entitlements. Sen demonstrated that famine often stems from economic rather than agrarian crisis, and that existing disparities in purchasing power at different levels of society can leave whole sectors vulnerable to starvation in times of economic upheaval. As a result of such work, uncovering the more complex structural causes of famine became a rigorous and focused economic and historical enterprise, rather than an environmental side note. In many respects, the Bengal famine of 1943, which Sen himself had lived through as a child, proved to be the perfect test case for his theory. From very early on, in fact, the Bengal famine was recognized to have been, in quotes, man-made. The editorial board of the premier English language newspaper in Calcutta at the time of famine, The Statesman, for one, shortly after breaking the story of famine in Bengal to an international audience, was arguing that famine in wartime Bengal was not the result of agricultural failure or a lack of food grains, but was rather, in its own words, a man-made catastrophe, resulting from poor administration and governmental bungling. In this context, there is little doubt that Sen himself grew up hearing that the Bengal famine of 1943 was a man-made disaster. This same understanding was, in fact, an extremely common refrain that I heard in many dozens of interviews I did with famine survivors during the course of my own research on Bengal. In some ways, then, Amartya Sen only lent theoretical weight to the widely held understanding that the Bengal famine was a man-made event. Although an economist himself, Amartya Sen's argument that famine is often caused not by a food availability decline, but essentially by poverty and economic crisis, has been extremely influential in historical studies of famine, and since 1980, focus on uncovering the causes of famine that stem from social, economic, and political structures rather than environmental or agrarian anomalies has become central to historical studies on famine. In relation to the Bengal famine of 1943, attention has increasingly turned to questions about the role of the colonial state and the responsibility for famine that might be assigned to the person of Winston Churchill in particular. Much of the particular focus on Churchill, it seems, stems from the popularity of journalist Madhushree Mukherjee's 2011 book, Churchill's Secret War. The book is a grim report of Churchill's obstinate insistence, despite dire warnings, to redirect available supplies away from India to deny imports. It is also a round indictment of Churchill's undeniable animosity and even spite towards Britain's colonized masses. Since the publication of Churchill's Secret War, discussions of Churchill's blame for famine in Bengal have gained considerable steam, with reports like Sotik Biswas's How Churchill Starved India appearing in the BBC and popular opinion in Bengal itself fixing on Churchill as the primary culprit. Recently, I personally received a solicitation from a prestigious historical journal to review a paper considering the question of whether Churchill should be understood to have been guilty of genocide in relation to the Bengal famine. In many ways, I have to say, such speculations do very little to advance popular or scholarly understandings of the tremendous complexity of famine in Bengal. Famine in mid-20th century Bengal is not simply the story of one bigoted and arrogant colonial potentate starving a population of restive brown folks into submission. It is rather a deep historical story involving complex chronologies of inequality, power, and impunity. Colonialism is undoubtedly a fundamental context of the long trajectory of disempowerment and hunger that erupts in 1943 in spectacular starvation. But famine in Bengal is also the story of how a destitute population caught in the crosshairs of international military conflict is sacrificed to the brutal calculus of totalizing military priority. It is also the story of the rapacity of capital feeding off war. Moreover, viewed from a still closer angle, the Bengal famine is a shocking story of the proliferation of local venalities, the hoarding of middle classes, the cruel expediency of extortionary intermediaries, and the mute complicities of an increasingly callous society at large, increasingly inured to death, becoming increasingly more indifferent month after month and then year after year. It is also the story of a mushrooming and pervasive moral bankruptcy, both colonial and Bengali, that stems from the burden of 1,000 banal decisions made in the face of spiraling calamity. In what follows, I will be tackling not only the question of Churchill's responsibility for famine, but also the larger question of the causal connection between colonialism and famine. Moreover, I will be questioning the entire premise of causality as a central hermeneutic in famine studies, one that seems to have trapped historical analysis in something of a teleological framework at the expense of complexity. While, of course, questions of causality are important, I argue that it is just as important to understand famine itself as a causal phenomena. Famine in many ways represents a singular spotlight on the structures, economic, social, and political, a kind of X-ray of the anatomy of power. It describes a limit situation that, if studied closely and minutely as an unfolding event, reveals the sclerotic anatomy of power in all its dimensions, a failure of society at every level, just as much as specifically a colonial catastrophe. The causes of the Bengal famine are in fact legion. There is all importantly war, the ideologies that war enabled, and as Amartya Sen identified, the inflationary crisis that war generated. There is profiteering and the proliferation of black market forces that denial, hoarding, and speculation engendered. There are the record exports from Bengal in 1942 and the failure of both colonial as well as Indian governance. There is the lack of cohesion and the sheer incompetence of a collapsing colonial state, and there's also the indifference of Bengal's moneyed classes, the invisibility of the poor, and very importantly, the rapacity of industrial capitalists, again, European and Indian alike, who were recording record profits as millions starved. The list could really go on. It is never, in fact, a simple exercise to account for the extraordinary death of millions of people anywhere on Earth. And that is why Holocaust studies has provided such a deep and prolific field of research, moving from the monstrosity of Adolf Hitler and the inner core of Nazism to more recent and complex studies of German society at large, the everyday history of fascism, the facilitation of Nazism by an international community, the convenient and deathly blind spots of even those arrayed against Nazism, etc. But back to the Bengal famine. On September 3rd, 1939, when England declared war on Germany, it also declared war against Germany on behalf of its far-flung empire as a whole. Subsequently, the idea of existential threat began to underwrite all domestic as well as colonial policy. Though an attack by Germany on India was highly improbable, mobilization in India began on a large scale. An air raid precaution service was formed in all cities of Bengal, which together with the civic and home guards amounted to an ad hoc militia of more than 200,000 loyalist forces by 1943. Mock bombings, complete with phosphorus bombs, ambulance crews, and stretchers to remove mock dead, were staged throughout Calcutta. Meanwhile, the Indian National Congress, the country's primary nationalist organ, withdrew from participation in the nascent transition to provisional self-rule. As such, much of the country reverted to emergency wartime rule, which allowed colonial authorities to wield an especially authoritarian hand. When Japan entered the war in December of 1941 and Singapore and Burma fell just a few short months later, Bengal became the front of the Axis-allied conflict, and Calcutta became the main supply front in a war in Asia that increasingly found the British on their heels. It also became a putative target for further Japanese advance. Rather than rallying around the Union Jack, as they were encouraged to do, however, Indian residents of Calcutta responded in less than patriotic ways. Those who had roots outside the city began to flee in large numbers, while those who had no village to retreat to treated the ARP drills with disregard and at times open disdain. Just as the native quarters were becoming ghost towns in the city, it was filling up with British as well as American troops, and the factories that supplied the war machine began to work overtime. Subsequently, the need for labor pressed hard on industrialists who were turning record profits already in war-related production. Laborers were recruited from Bengal's impossibly vast hinterland to keep the supply train running. Into this mix walked tens of thousands of bedraggled and half-dead refugees from British Burma who entered the city in desperation, telling tales of Japanese atrocities and British capitulation. The province of Bengal, meanwhile, had been labeled a dangerous area, and colonial officials themselves were making plans to move their families out of harm's way. Japan had proved itself a daring and ruthless enemy, and there were prevailing fears that Calcutta would be next. While the rhetoric of defense, however, escalated, military protection of Calcutta remained minimal at best, and only certain ad hoc measures were taken to thwart Japanese attack, measures which would have catastrophic consequences for the residents of Bengal. The plan that the colonial government came up with, in lieu of actual military preparation, amounted to a scorched earth campaign in Bengal. The first measure of denial, as the scheme was called, was to confiscate all surplus rice in coastal districts so that Japan could not appropriate them in the event of attack. Towards this end, government agents, backed by law enforcement, went into the countryside and by force and coercion snatched up all the rice that they could find. This rice ostensibly would be used to feed Calcutta and keep the industrial labor force contented. Much of it, however, was merely removed from open markets and hoarded in corporate godowns, while starvation began to mount. Already by April of 1942, the price of rice had risen dangerously, and there was distress in both the city and the countryside. Denial upped the ante, putting further pressure on prices, disorganizing the traditional market system, and alerting an already uneasy population to the colonial state's mounting anxiety. After rice denial, the colonial government moved on to a scheme of boat denial. The idea here was to deny potential Japanese landing forces the opportunity of appropriating local conveyance to advance on Calcutta. In the period of a few short months, a total of more than 46,000 boats were requisitioned for military purposes, sunken, destroyed, or otherwise removed from use, crippling the riverine transportation infrastructure of deltaic Bengal. Calcutta, in the process, was further centralized, and the periphery and rural areas further estranged. Subsequently, as life in the districts began to deteriorate, those who had fled Calcutta months earlier began to straggle back in search of increasingly scarce resources. Accordingly, the needs of the city escalated still further. On December 20th of 1942, Calcutta was bombed for the first time by the Japanese. The damage by official report was slight, but panic gripped the city. Most alarmingly, rice merchants and large stockists boarded up their shops and departed for safer harbors, even while the colonial government had to keep war production running. Nervous of their access to food supplies to feed industrial laborers and the military, government broke the locks on shuttered private warehouses and requisitioned all the rice they could find. 2/3 of the available stocks in Calcutta were summarily seized, and according to the Famine Inquiry Commission's report on Bengal, in quotes, "From that moment, the crisis had begun," end quote. The trade system from root to branch was thrown into complete disarray as prices skyrocketed and more supplies went into a thriving black market. Government and industrial interests descended again and again on the countryside, abandoning price controls and buying up and indeed confiscating all the paddy that they could lay their hands on. While in Calcutta, speculators and hoarders began to rule the trade. Middle-class Bengalis who had fled the bombings in Calcutta earlier now returned to claim their seat at the table as conditions in the countryside grew ever more ominous. Close on their heels was a wave of starving villagers who began to crash onto the shores of Calcutta by May of 1943. They came naked or draped in rags and filled the lanes and by-lanes of the city with their broken bodies, human skeletons uttering plaintive moans, begging for the starch water that is the byproduct of cooking rice. The hunger that had been haunting the rural districts of Bengal for some years since had reached the pitch of starvation and could no longer be denied. Calcutta's premier English newspaper, The Statesman, published a photo essay of starvation on the streets of the city, and the Bengal Famine of 1943, as it has been known ever since, was born. It was really at this stage that the call for London to authorize imports, which might have broken the back of the inflationary cycle, became paramount. And it was at this stage that Winston Churchill, in his role as the chair of the War Cabinet, repeatedly scuttled attempts to solve the food problem, as it was called, in India, by blocking imports. Churchill's opinions of colonial questions were arch. He disdained nationalist movements and seemed to have a particular animus against the independence movement in India. In 1942, the British faced the most violent backlash against the colonial state it had witnessed since 1857 in the form of the Quit India movement. At this juncture, Churchill undoubtedly saw Indian opposition to colonial rule as an alliance with the enemy. He refused payments of a massive IOU that England had accumulated in relation to the extraction of war materials and personnel from India, exacerbating wartime inflation. Just a few weeks before the Statesman published its photos announcing famine to the world, Churchill himself was valorizing Britain's colonial mission in India to the public in Britain, heeding the world as a whole to recognize the great achievements of Britain in India, end quote. Famines, he suggested, had passed away and pestilence had been defeated. Even after news of the starvation of Bengal had been revealed to the world, at a meeting of the War Cabinet to discuss imports to India, Churchill dominated the debate, breaking into, in quotes, a preliminary flourish on Indians breeding like rabbits, end quote. By this time, hundreds of thousands had starved to death, and many millions teetered on the barest edge of survival. Yet, however extreme Churchill's views, his actions in relation to imports, sterling balances, and Indian nationalism might be, they are only really the tip of the colonial iceberg. What we find when we look closer are myriad decisions and enactments related to colonial arrogance, which contributed just as much to famine. At every level of the colonial administration, one finds dismissal, indifference, denial, and even spite. Beneath Churchill, the Secretary of State for India, throughout the war years, advanced extreme measures to deal with dissent, including arguing for the arrest of the entire Indian National Congress and the authorization of machine gunning from the air during the Quit India movement. Directly beneath the Secretary of State, the Chief Executive of the Government of India, the Viceroy and Governor General Linlithgow, argued throughout the period for undemocratic means to dismiss elected Indian officials and establish martial law. In office, when news broke that tens and perhaps hundreds of thousands of colonial subjects were starving in Bengal, Linlithgow left office, feeling he was leaving British India, in his own words, in pretty good trim. Beneath Linlithgow were 11 provincial governors, civil service men, many of them knights of England, who often resented their colonial postings, found Indians impossible to deal with, and exercised discretionary powers that made a mockery of provisions of self-rule. John Herbert, erstwhile governor of Bengal, was known by his superiors as among, in quotes, the weakest of all provincial governors. In March of 1943, he hatched a backroom plot to topple the populist chief minister of Bengal, Fazlul Haq, and foisted in a Muslim League ministry in its place. This set the stage for the divisive and deathly communal showdown in years to come. A few weeks before the news of famine broke, Herbert, like so many colonial governors in India before him, took ill and died shortly thereafter. His replacement, Sir Thomas Rutherford, who would have to deal with famine at its deathly apex, had no prior experience in Bengal, and like Herbert before him, was criticized by the Viceroy as second-rate at best, in the Viceroy's own words. He also fell ill and spent much of the critical period of famine recuperating in a villa in Darjeeling. Serving beneath these levels of executive power were members of the Indian Civil Service, or ICS, the so-called steel frame of British rule in India. The ICS was an elite and rather closely knit network of colonial officials whose skills and aptitudes had to be adjusted according to contingent colonial appointments. Excuse me. Governors, secretaries, district magistrates, commissioners, and the directors of various agencies all formed this steel frame of colonial authority in some 250 districts of British India. They rotated through positions and postings that were as dependent on social networks at least as much as on administrative competence. By the 1940s, the Indian civil service was known to be a moribund administrative corps, riven by corruption and indifference, exercising little local knowledge and less concern about the local population. ICS officer L.G. Panel had a particularly deep involvement with colonial policy in Bengal that directly contributed to famine. Once a secretary to the viceroy in early 1942, Panel was appointed special officer in charge of the denial scheme in Bengal. Panel oversaw the coordination of the military and private trade interests that executed the expropriation of rice and boats in coastal Bengal, which began the thorough unraveling of the local economy. Panel acted often with a heavy hand, arming convoys and barking orders at local traders in broken Bengali. The heavy hand that Panel employed not only led to oppression of the agrarian countryside, it also led to increased panic throughout Bengal, an important catalyst to the inflation that began galloping just about at the same time. When inflation began swiftly whittling away the purchasing power of poor agriculturalists, fishermen, and tradespeople, hunger began escalating. Panel himself was appointed director of the newly minted Civil Supplies Department. In this capacity, he facilitated, at times with military escort, repeated schemes to allow industrial interests to raid rural Bengal for rice. In fact, there is no colonial official, including Churchill, whose fingerprints are more scattered over the history of the Bengal famine than those of L.G. Panel. If, however, we are merely looking to assign blame for famine, we might miss an equally important aspect of the relationship between colonialism and famine in Bengal. To locate any singular blame for famine, whether that be in the person of Churchill or whether that be the colonial state as a whole, is perhaps to give colonial hegemony more than its due. Flipping the script, so to speak, if we ask instead, what can famine tell us about colonialism? One must come to the conclusion that it is the sheer incompetence of the state that best describes famine in Bengal. Far from establishing a hegemonic presence in India, the colonial state, as late as 1943, had very little knowledge of local populations and limited capacities of governance or management. This lent a persistent aspect of confusion as well as overreach to the problem of executing wartime policy. At every level of administration, we find sickness, inertia, resentment, and discord. The defeats of World War II in Asia by 1942 had only demoralized spirits further. The ICS was a failing institution. Miscommunications, petty squabbling, and trained indifference defined an administration in total collapse. Government had neither the means nor the will to contend with the far-reaching breakdown of economic and social order that famine represented and out of which it had mushroomed. But, and here's the crux, focusing on exclusive light on colonial aspects of the famine masks other factors that were perhaps equally as important. For one thing, many of the policies that led directly to famine in Bengal were done in the name of war and the suggested urgency of martial priority. The centralization of Calcutta as a hub of production and export, the denial scheme that crippled the rice trade and transportation infrastructure, the repeated efforts to bring more and more rice into Calcutta to ease industrial, labor-related anxieties, the panic engendered by British defeats and trepidation, and many other aspects of war proved, one can rightly argue, the necessary condition of famine in Bengal. The relation between international conflict and famine is deep, and one that can be identified in a whole host of famine situations, including in many places today, like Yemen and Somalia. In the total war of World War II, priorities were established globally that posited the sacrifice of large populations. Caught in the crosshairs of international conflicts, millions starved in Russia, in Vietnam, in China, and elsewhere. War in a colonial setting undoubtedly entailed different enactments of martial ideology, but when we ask, what can famine tell us about the priorities established in the name of total war, we are able to touch on roots of famine that extend beyond questions of colonial impunity. Martial law, expropriation of public resources, disregard for the welfare of marginal classes, and calculations of acceptable collateral damage were widespread across the planet. War grinds bodies into pulp in many different ways at once. What we see in Bengal in 1943, however, cannot merely also be explained by examining the enactments of colonialism or war in isolation. We must also look to the self-interest of colonial as well as colonized actors alike. While the extent of the impoverishment of Bengal's rural masses can be traced closely to the colonial economy, the invisibility of the poor within colonial society represents a far more domestic form of marginalization and disregard. Evidence of acute hardship and even starvation had been reported in rural districts of Bengal since at least 1934. By the end of that same decade, many small tenants had lost their lands to unscrupulous Bengali moneylenders and were insolvent. In Calcutta, middle-class white-collar workers were increasingly insulated from the miseries of the rural poor. Politics, society, and even nationalism most often failed to address the poverty that was hollowing out the countryside. Rigid caste and class distinctions defined a partition of concern that rendered the hunger of millions invisible to those enjoying relative prosperity. When in 1942, Gandhi fasted in the names, in his own words, of the privations of the poor millions, a leaders' conference was called in Delhi. Many of the scions of Indian industry and politics attended to express their support for Gandhi. But no mention was made about the material welfare of the population which Gandhi had mentioned. This same conference was sponsored by one of Bengal's leading industrialists, G.D. Birla. Birla himself, as well as several members of the Viceroy's Indianized Executive Committee, were deeply invested in Calcutta's wartime boom. Many of the jute and cotton mills operating in and around Calcutta were in fact Indian establishments. During the war, these interests partners with government and military authority to ravage the Bengal countryside for rice. There's good evidence as well that the Marwari community in particular was quite active in grain speculation and hoarding, a primary cause of the inflation out of which famine mushroomed. A conflict between the government of India and owners of rice mills greatly impacted rice supplies in Calcutta. This in turn justified repeated raids of the countryside to bolster Calcutta's stocks. And even while industrial interests were amassing stockpiles, so too did white-collar workers in Calcutta begin to hoard on large scale. All of these moneyed interests were just as shocked by the eruption of famine as were colonial authorities, even though their own responsibilities for famine were great. Meanwhile, in the lanes of Calcutta, the living skeletons of famine could beg for no more than the starch runoff of rice at the back door of genteel Calcuttans, who often regarded famine victims with outright disdain. In many of these homes, there were large hoardings of raw rice. In short, the extent to which the social structure of Bengali society impacted famine is an interesting subject indeed, and one that sadly has very important implications even today, as large sectors of Bengali society remain on the barest margins of survival while remaining all but invisible to the relatively wealthy. For many of the elite of Bengal, in fact, famine became a tool of power, a way of mobilizing identities and establishing authority. Blame for famine was slung between the Hindu Mahasabha and the Muslim League freely and with great enthusiasm. Nationalist forces, led again by Birla, used famine as a wedge against the colonial state, refusing to participate in and actively attempting to sabotage government relief efforts. When the impasse in rice markets was finally broken by a military distribution of food grains, the rice that hit the market was often spoiled, indicating it had been many long years in corporate warehouses. In fact, if one begins to look at the unfolding of famine, many different causal factors can be identified. But what is more, the architecture of not only the colonial state, but also of Bengali society and economy is revealed in stark relief. If we take the four primary factors that I have outlined here, colonialism, war, capitalist profiteering, and existing structures of inequality in society into account, we are approaching a better understanding of what caused the Bengal famine. However, if, as I am arguing, we embark on something other than a causal explanation of famine and look instead at the intricate enactments that describe famine historically, we also discover something more about the anatomy of colonial rule, the ideological mania of total war, and the pernicious structural mechanisms of Bengal society that mask the suffering of the poor. Moreover, we can see the interplay between colonialism, war, and famine, gaining important insights into each. Famine and hunger in this sort of enterprise become hermeneutics towards understanding power and disempowerment more broadly. This is why, as I have argued elsewhere, it is important to examine famine in considerable depth as an unfolding event. It is important to detail famine in medias res, far more so perhaps than identifying causes or looking to assign particular blame. This is not to say that the culprits of famine should receive a pass, but rather to say that a more thorough examination of the dynamics of power, society, politics, and economy goes further to reveal the deathly mechanics of famine than having causality drive investigations. Thank you.
Thank you, Janam, not only perfectly on time, but also very thought-provoking historical exposition. And I have to say that your reference to the Mukherjee book was well taken, because it is rather troubling. I'm all for public history, but that book has, and that interpretation has overshadowed some of the actual hard work that economists and historians have been doing on the Bengal famine, and made it part of this great man, whether a great do-gooder or a great criminal view of history. I may be being a little harsh, but we can talk about it. And now I invite Professor Graziosi to give his very thoughtful, broader exposition on this.
So I'm very grateful to the REC who brought me here, and of course also because of this furthering of this comparative studies of famines in the 20th century, which I think is a very great idea, and it's very much needed. And actually, I don't see contradictions in between analyzing it under famines in communism or in this. That is, what we need is a differentiated approach that is capable of getting out of this comparison as much knowledge as possible. Of course, my role here is a very difficult one, in the sense that while the commentator to the Irish paper and to the Ukrainian papers were specialists of both Irish and, how to say, Ukrainian history, I'm not a specialist in Bengali history, and so I will tell you what I tried to do. First of all, though, I want to say that I very much liked Mukherjee paper, and I especially like this approach, is what I think is strongest point, which is this call to a molecular approach, can I say so, that is to look at famine as the result of a myriad, to quote him, decisions and enactments of colonial and colonized, and actually of various strata of both colonial and colonized, and to situate it in its broader framework, to see at human action, human and different human action in this very disaggregated way. This I liked very much, and to see at the plurality, at the fragmentation of actors and decisions. And the only question I have is at times this approach that I very much like and inspired the paper throughout. So I think this is the very strong point. That at times there are sudden generalization that I do not get. How do they get there? But because maybe they presuppose that one reads the book and not the article. But the approach is certainly very welcome, I think, because generalities tend to become empty after a while. And they become judgmental too, which is not a good thing for historians to be. What I try to do, since I'm not a specialist, is to compare, that is to use the Bengali picture that Mukherjee presented us with to what I know about the Soviet famines, that is the Ukrainian and the Kazakh too, basically. One could add others, but I have only 10 minutes. And the first thing that comes out, though, it's, of course, there are similarities. Needless to say, for example, in the suffering, in the survival strategies, you can imagine, right? If you are dying of hunger, of course, millions of people dying of hunger. We are all human beings, so you can imagine how much of a common ground there is. And there are also other similarities, and I will draw your attention to them. But basically, I would say that what I get out of it that strikes me most are the differences. That is how, and this also tell me how fertile this exercise in comparison can be, because it helps us illuminate through the differences our common, a more profound, deeper understanding of these processes. This, I think, and so you will forgive me if I try to do this comparative, which at times is not very simple, but so the first thing we have is a war economy in Bengal, and in a colonial situation with a real war, especially after 41 and the Japanese approaching. And so you have a famine linked to a war situation in a colonial setting. And of course, this brings us to mind, the Russian situation, the imperial Russian situation, and the communist Russian situation in 1918, 1919, more than in 1932-33, because there was peace on earth in 1930, at least on earth in Europe and in the Soviet Union. So was the war economy element lacking in the Soviet Union in 1932-33? No. But you have to look at it from another perspective, because, of course, one could argue, and that has been argued by Lenin for the first time, that the Soviet economic system was a war economy system. And it was an extreme war economy system, copied from the German war economy system in 1918, that tended to concentrate all the power in the state hand, and the state, since 1928, was waging a war against its own populations. Let's use the plural, because there were the Kazakhs, the Ukrainians, the Cossacks, the Russians too, one has to say, and many other peoples, as we know. The Caucasus was a little spared, the Trans-Caucasus, in a way, Armenia, Georgia. So what you have is in the Soviet Union is a political system that operates a war economy system in a very extreme way against its own population. Here too, there is a similarity in the mechanism, because it's a war economy mechanism, but the difference is very strong. In Bengal, I like this very much in the paper, there is a great plurality of actors. Because, of course, we know how India is a complicated country. Actually, the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union were very complicated countries. There were many similarities. Even Nehru liked to make this similarity between the India and the Soviet Union, that there were many languages, many ethnic, but in India you had the Muslim, the communalism, as Nehru liked to say. There was the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress having a different approach to the war, and which brought that there were the case systems. There were a lot of complication. Plus there was the colonial system in place. Plus there was a local capitalist and landowning system of various stratification. One could say, I think, that, again, the similarity was deeper before 1914-17. What could maintain it in that socialism, in quotation mark, that is what happened after, let's say, 1914 and up to the Civil War and then the 20s, the 30s, was a process of simplification of the Soviet social and economic system, which there were less actors. Not that there were very few, there were still a lot of actors, the Georgians, the Armenians, the communists, the peasants, but still was much less differentiated than it was before 1917 and the Civil War. Let's put it this way. So you have less actors and a much simpler social stratification. Think of the elimination of landowners, of capitalists. And there was a political power that was much more concentrated in the Soviet Union. This, I think, is extremely important to remember. Another thing that, of course, is in both places, but I think is different, it's import-export question. You have a denial of import in India up to a certain moment, because at a certain moment they start to give rice, or not through import, but through the... So there was... And you have export. In the Soviet Union, you have forced export for many years, and you have no distribution of food, but in May 1933 to a selected group of peasants that had to produce. So you have a much more extreme, again, use of this mechanism. And again, if you can draw a parallel between Churchill and Stalin, which could be done in a way compared to this import-export business, I think Stalin would come out as the winner, because in 1932 he did import grain in the summer, because he knew what had to be done. We know that in May, June 1932, they imported grain from Persia, from Asia, because there were already, how to say, famine spots in not only the Ukraine, so there was some import. But after the November 32, no import was possible. And again, we arrived to the same denial of famine, which was there again in both places, but in India, at a certain point, the famine came out. In the Soviet Union, the denial of famine went on until 1989, if I'm correct. That is, we had to live with the denial of the existence of the famine for about 6 years, and which we know was a very deliberate policy that has no parallel, I think, in any other state. What is more difficult to compare is let's call it national question. Because of course in India too there was a national question, a communal, I don't know if people like this term, it was the term that Nehru and all the Indians used, and clearly the Muslim Indian fight played a great role. And the English national, let's say, colonial attitude. Let me just to remind you that Stalin changed the title of his book from Marxism and the National Question into Marxism and the National and the Colonial Question. So Stalin was perfectly aware of what we are discussing here today. And I don't think, though, that, again, Churchill had a theory of nation building and nation destroying, which Stalin clearly had. If you think of Stalin policies in the 20s with the Korenizatsia, indigenization, clearly there was a lot of nation building. If you think of what he did to Ukraine, but not only to Ukraine, after the fall of 1932, you have a conscious policy of nation destroying. Think of what happened to the language. This you have no parallel, I think, in India. Think of the policies, they changed the orthography, they changed dictionaries, they put the elite, the cultural elite and the political elite in jail. So there is a conscious element of national policy that I don't see. Maybe I'm mistaken because I don't know the India the Indian situation so well, but it seems to me that you really have a theoretical approach to the question, a conscious approach to the question that is implicit maybe in Churchill in his attitude toward India, but is never taken to a theoretical level. Again, things that are similar there, but in a different way. The preference for the city. Of course, in Calcutta too, Mukherjee told us very clearly, so I will, 2 minutes, okay. So just the cities, and then a final point on Sen. There were many other things that one wanted to say. That the city where people get, refugees went to the cities. Cities were privileged, food was in the cities, not in the countryside, and people fled to the city. In Ukraine, but not only in Ukraine, this was not possible. Because as we know, they introduced the internal passport at the end of 1932, precisely to prevent this. And what he called, very rightly, the invisibility of the poor was a psychological invisibility in Calcutta, because the poor were in the street of Calcutta dying, more or less. There were some.
After 40.
Yes, after 40. But in Kharkov and Kiev, they were not allowed. So the city dwellers, we have a few pictures of the very few that were able to pass through the filters, but they never got there. So there is still another element of similarity, yet of great difference. And there were many other points that one would have liked to stress. But this leads to me at the end on Amartya Sen theory, and I think it applies very well to India and to the famine of India, but there are problems in applying it to the Soviet famines, I believe. Because what you have in the Soviet Union, you have a food availability decline, for sure, in between 1930-33, but above all, you don't have, the entitlements become something else, become what Osokina, she was the first, I think, to put a theory on it, that called the hierarchy of потребления, that is a hierarchy of consumption, that is the state determining who get what, at what level. Peasants, no, nothing. Workers in small centers, a little bit. Workers in textile industry, in average centers, a little more. Provincial cadres. So there was a hierarchy of rationing that cut out completely 90% of the population, more or less, and cut out completely, for example, the Kazakh, in which I think we could find a lot of what is said, because in the Kazakh case, you find, with this I finish, there's another thing that one wanted to discuss, that everyday decisions, the Slavs, these were not only Russians in Kazakhstan, there were also Ukrainian for sure, and Belarusian, every day took decision that marginalized the Kazakhs nomads with the little food that was available, and led to the greatest national tragedy, maybe, in relative terms in the Soviet Union. So what I would like to say is that comparing always gives us a much deeper understanding of famines, and tell us not to resort to general theories too much, because if we resort to general theories, this is just too much, then it's too easy to explain, and also the perpetrators are too easy to explain, the behaviors are too easy to explain, and instead everything is much more difficult, which doesn't mean we cannot explain it. Thank you so much.
And what I suggest, if we have a discussion, we can go to 4:45 and begin our last session at 4:45.
Thank you so much, Frank and Marta, for making that possible. Now I'm going to use chair's privilege and suggest that in the interest of optimizing time, we would ask the participants specifically, let's see, Joanna, Kieran, is it? And Sri Manjari, who are the three specialists on South Asia, since Professor Graziosi very humbly, and in my opinion, underestimating himself, said he was not an expert. But if you would like to talk specifically to the Bengal famine, and your other work on famine and hunger. And so I'll take those questions together. Please keep them brief. And if there are any other questions from other participants, we can take them in a consolidated block, and then we'll ask Janam to give us, his response, and so that we can end on 4:45 for the next session. Thank you.
Can I make observations instead of asking questions? Is that possible?
Yeah, of course.
I must congratulate Janam for an excellent presentation, and I also want to add that to a great extent, in fact, almost completely, I do agree with the position that famine, particularly the Bengal famine of 1943, requires an in-depth analysis, and we cannot indulge in blame game. But at the same time, I would like to assert that somewhere India, and particularly, India as such got drawn into the war because of colonialism, because of the fact that we were a colony. And to that extent, I think we can talk about the responsibility of the colonial structures, both at the center and at the provincial level. Secondly, I would like to talk about the famine economy to some extent, because somewhere there is an overemphasis on the export of rice, and there is an overemphasis on the export of rice to areas like Ceylon, Sri Lanka during the wartime. But we also need to look at the jute economy of Bengal, dominated by the European jute manufacturers as well as the Indian, and the dichotomy between the jute growers of East Bengal and the jute mill owners, both European and Indian, and the way in which the war affects both differently, and the way in which the famine affects the jute growers completely. And here we can, to a large extent, make use of, as you yourself said, the entitlement approach of Amartya Sen. Because some of these groups were absolutely vulnerable because they were extremely poor, but at the same time they were tied up to the market economy completely. They were tied to the market structure. So on one hand, we have lowering of the price of raw jute, and we have increase in jute manufacture in the cities, in the city of Calcutta, and there is an increase in the export of jute. So the jute growers do not benefit from the war economy, whereas the jute manufacturers benefit from it. And very interestingly, the official that you referred to, L.G. Pinel, commented on this in the Famine Inquiry Commission in 1944-45. So he's a different man at the end of the war. To some extent, we can say that, because he's instrumental for introducing the price control mechanism for the first time. And towards the end of the war, in front of the Famine Inquiry Commission, he talks about the responsibility of individuals, both manufacturers, and he also talks about how the jute growers suffered and had a raw deal throughout 1939 to 45 because of the way in which the war economy functioned. And another person that another individual that we must keep in mind while talking about the famine is Manilal B. Nanavati, who was the only one who gave his note of dissent to the Famine Inquiry Commission. And he admits very openly in his note of dissent that the famine was war-related and the deaths were preventable. The famine was a man-made famine, and as a man-made famine, there was no dearth of food production. The fact that we have a famine amidst plenty is something that he draws attention to. So these are a few points that I wanted to talk about.
Thank you. This was Dr. Sri Manjari, and in fact, I would direct you, along with Janam Mukherjee's Hungry Bengal, to Dr. Sri Manjari's Between War and Famine, War and Famine, Bengal 1939 to 45, which came out from New Delhi Orient Longman in 2009. Now, there are two other respondents I would ask to quickly come up, and the first one is another participant, Joanna Simonov, who's here all the way from Zurich, and whose work emphasizes the role of the media and civil society actors in issues of hunger and starvation.
Yeah, well, Janam, thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more on the question of the periodization of the Bengal famine. So I think your book makes a really important contribution by dislocating the famine from the year 1943 and also talking about the following years leading up to India's independence, and this then touches upon the issue of how do we understand famine, how do we understand structural poverty, and how do we understand then malnutrition. And the second question that I have really relates to my own research. How important was really then the publication of the Statesman and then the role of the media in pressuring the governments to act and respond to the famine? Thank you.
We have a third respondent, who's also a doctoral student and who's in fact a historian of medicine. And his name is Kieran Fitzpatrick, and he is here from St. John's College, Oxford. And after that, we'll have 10 minutes, a little more than 10 minutes, maybe. No, 10 minutes for Janam to respond. Thank you.
Janam, thanks for that paper. It was fantastic. I particularly liked your mention of incompetence, because I think there's probably a history of imperialism and colonialism to be written in terms of incompetence, rather than an assumption of absolute power. And I was wondering how you think you might go about that, because I think you have a history to be written about the way that different institutions interacted and were in tension with one another in India. So you mentioned the Indian Civil Service, but there's also the Indian Medical Service, the Public Works Department. And we need to get away from assuming that all of these various institutions were in harmony with one another, and maybe uncover the battles that were fought between them. So if you could just say something about that, that would be great.
Thanks. Janam, all yours, 10 minutes.
Yeah, quite a lot to respond to. I appreciate the comparative scope. And I just wanted to say something. Churchill, if we call Stalin a nationalist in terms of the Soviet sense, I think we can equally call Churchill a nationalist in terms of the imperial sense. Churchill's sense of propriety over the colonies was certainly as strong as Stalin's sense of propriety over Eastern Europe, and Churchill's kind of unwillingness to give up the colonies, his understanding of it being part of Great Britain was very much a part of his entire political project, but even his own personal sense of identity as as a ruler. But really interesting, I think, comparisons and points of reference between the two. Dr. Srimanjari, excellent comment on jute. Obviously very important, and to get into the agricultural production in Bengal, jute is the primary in the eastern parts of Bengal, modern-day Bangladesh, was in this period of time the primary kind of cash monetary crop, and indeed jute growers had been impoverished throughout the 1920s and 1930s, and by the 1940s were very much insolvent, and then the fluctuations in the price of jute left them particularly vulnerable. But that is also true with so many of the agriculturals across the board. Jute growers were a particularly large number of people, and so their numbers and their mortality numbers were huge. But a lot of rice growers themselves also fell victim to famine, as well as fishermen, as well as potters in the Chittagong regions, also in that eastern regions, because they couldn't move clay around with the appropriation of the boats, etc. But jute is so fundamental to the Bengal economy, certainly. And the question of jute and the kind of longue durée of impoverishment that is certainly located in the colonial era. And I don't mean to dismiss the colonial question. I mean, colonialism is part and parcel to the famine, and maybe I'm making something more of a straw man of the kind of blame put on Churchill than is necessary. I mean, colonialism, the functioning of colonialism, the kind of also racial questions around colonialism, the disregard for the Indian population, the kind of consolidations of authority around European power, etc., are fundamental to how famine kind of evolves. But I do think there's, particularly in the Indian population, particularly in Bengal itself, until this day, a really lack of responsibility for the class structure in Bengali society, at which, I mean, you had people converging on Bengal, starving to death, who were not considered, you know, brothers and sisters. Let's point that out quite frankly. They were, you know, denied the charity and the resources to survive throughout Bengal, where there's a very rigid division of class and indeed caste, I think, should really, and no one's really looked at the extent of caste during the famine and how caste also plays into the marginalization of large sectors of society in Bengal. Very important. And I think, you know, in my book, I stress very much about the periodization of famine, and it's something I'm very interested in also. Almost every famine has a year attached to it, you know, not only in Bengal, but everywhere, the Holodomor or the Tonkin famine, or, you know, and these are often ways of kind of creating a demarcated famine as a demarcated event. And one of the things that, you know, Mike Davis really looks at is the question of famine being really a extraordinary period within a long durée of deprivation, of disempowerment, of disenfranchisement and everything. And if we look in Bengal in the 1930s, people are starving to death. What makes 43 the famine is very much that the statesmen, I think, and I get this idea also from the elderly people I've spoken to at great length. People give huge credit to the famine, to the statesmen for breaking the story of the famine. The Statesman, an independent British newspaper operating in Calcutta with a global circulation, very important to news on the Eastern Front. The editor of The Statesman, Ian Stevens, although there's a ban on a censorship of any comment on famine, even the word famine is censored from the press, he takes a decision to print, instead of mentioning famine or using the word famine, to print a photo spread of people suffering a famine. And overnight, they were selling out in London, in Delhi. Overnight, this became an international kind of sensation. It's also important, though, and why I also want to kind of de-emphasize the colonial as much, the international community and the internationalism of the economy and the international aspects of famine in Bengal are extremely important and are also elided by a particular focus on Churchill and the colonial circumstance. Roosevelt himself was very aware, and America was very much embroiled in Calcutta. They had, you know, tens of thousands of troops moving through Calcutta. American soldiers were extremely well paid relative to British soldiers. Their expenditure on whiskey, on ice, on you know, meat, on fish, etc., in the city of Calcutta and in the military installations in Bengal has direct implications on the kind of runaway inflation. And Roosevelt knew well what was going on in Bengal, chose not to do anything, never made a mention of the Bengal famine, although the United States is using Calcutta as its main outpost for its movements against Japan, and in fact blocked the resources that were just made available by the nascent UNRWA, which is the United Nations kind of program to provide supplies to people. So the responsibilities for the famine are also international as well as colonial, as well as, importantly, I think, domestic as well. But the question of periodization, we see people starving in the 30s in Bengal, this kind of sudden, you know, sensationalism and spectacle of starvation that happens in 43, 44, with literally hundreds of thousands of people starving to death, and the scale certainly there. But we see famine conditions working at least until 1946, and this is one of the things that Amartya Sen's work in Poverty and Famines, he identifies 46 as the end of his study of famine mortality. So he's far beyond 43, which is the year always assigned to the famine, but he disrupts his then study of mortality and connection to famine with 46 because of Hindu-Muslim violence. I extended past that, and I'm trying to generate a conversation in Calcutta today that is gaining some steam. Did the Bengal famine ever end? We have conditions in Bengal today of poverty and impoverishment and indeed starvation that have really extended from 1943 until the present. And I think sometimes the effort to kind of periodize famine is a claim of power, that power has done its job and put an end to the bleeding, so to speak. And I think often these demarcations are rather artificial. And then the question of a history of incompetence is a very interesting one. And certainly incompetence is part and parcel of the maladministration that leads to the economic breakdowns in Bengal at every level. So yeah, very interesting insight also.
Thank you so much. That was a terrific response, and we had a wonderful discussion, I think, and I'm sure there will be space for more later in the evening, but also tomorrow. Thank you very much, and I invite the next set of panelists to come up here.
We will give you first. You have 5 minutes maximum to move and shift yourself and get back in your chairs. I will only point out one thing. For those of you who are visitors to Toronto, we are right near Queen's Park. And Queen's Park, one would expect in the country which celebrates Queen Victoria's birthday, would have a statue to Queen Victoria. We do not. We have a statue to Edward VII. And if you go closer to the statue, you will find out it was a gift from the people of Calcutta who didn't want it anymore to the people of the Belfast of the New World. Parsimonious Toronto got its statue, and therefore there's a whole story of colonial relations.